On a chilly November morning, the door of the main branch of Heritage First Bank in Memphis creaked open a little audibly to admit a short, thin, elderly man. His steps were unhurried, but there was a confidence in them that was uncommon in casual visitors. The old black man's gray hair protruded from under a shabby hat, and on his shoulders hung a shabby coat, worn by the years. In one hand he held an old leather suitcase with frayed corners that time had left more marks on it than on his own face. The door slammed quietly behind him, and the bank resumed its usual silence. The clerks at the counters automatically glanced at him, some without even concealing a slight chuckle. Such figures did not linger long in the wealthy neighborhood of Memphis, and everyone had already decided for himself that the old man was obviously at the wrong address. But he kept walking forward, past the surprised customers, among whom an elderly white lady immediately pulled her expensive purse toward her, and two young employees at the counter exchanged brief glances and snickers. When he stopped in the center of the spacious hall, next to the marble column, no one had time to pay much attention to his face. But those who did look noticed a strange calmness in his dark eyes, the kind of calm that comes from people who have not come for a handout or for pity or by mistake. The old man stood upright, almost motionless, as if there were no trembling or fatigue in his body. He looked around slowly at everyone present and said in a steady voice without raising his tone, but so that the words echoed clearly through the room, "I've come to take what's mine." There was a pause for a second, almost imperceptible, and then someone's laughter swept through the room like a light gust of draft. Someone chuckled at the window, one of the cashiers smirked at a colleague, and a customer at the counter whispered something like, "What a circus." Dennis Brooks, a security guard with an impressive belly and a wiry bald head, immediately straightened up in his chair and walked slowly toward the old man, squaring his shoulders defiantly. He always liked moments when he could show his importance in front of his customers. On his face there appeared the smirk of a man who was going to deal with a small nuisance easily and quickly. The old man didn't move, didn't even glance at the approaching guard. His attention was fixed on the people in the hall, as if he was watching everyone's reaction. Dennis took another step and opened his mouth, but at that moment Rick Coleman, the manager of the department, appeared in the hall. Rick Coleman, a trim man in his 40s with short-cropped blonde hair and a demeanor typical of those who are used to controlling situations. Rick approached calmly, without irritation, but with that cold interest that people used to dealing with eccentric customers have. He stopped a few feet away from the old man, giving Dennis a look that said, "I'll take care of it." Smiling, he said calmly, politely, but with a note of superiority, "Sir, you should probably leave the building. The bank does not serve." He didn't finish the sentence. The old man turned his head toward him and said softly, almost as in a conversation between two old acquaintances, "50 years ago this bank buried me at number 214. Today I wish to be resurrected." A strange silence hung in the hall. Someone even froze with a pen in his hand. Another, without waiting for change, remained standing, unable to take his eyes off this strange scene. Dennis, who had been grinning, suddenly felt an unpleasant chill run down his spine. There was no anger, no threat, no madness in this old man's voice. It was something else, too calm and too dangerous. Rick lowered his eyes for a second to the suitcase in the old man's hand, then looked into his eyes again. And somehow he couldn't say a word right away. Rick Coleman ran his palm over his face before gesturing the older man to the door at the back of the room that led to his office. He understood, to put the old man out on the street right now would mean making an unnecessary scene in front of customers and staff, and he couldn't stand that. Better to settle this quietly, away from prying eyes. Charles E. Whitaker nodded demurely and followed without a word, still clutching his old suitcase in his hand. There was a tense silence in Rick's office, furnished in the standard corporate style, glass desk, gray chairs, minimalist paintings on the walls. Dennis Brooks stood silently at the door, arms folded across his chest, showing that he was there for order only. Rick lowered himself into a chair, opened his notebook defiantly and looked up at Charles. He slowly set the suitcase on the floor, carefully unbuckled the worn leather straps and pulled out a folder of yellowed papers neatly folded and tied with twine. Rick reached for one of the folders, but Charles carefully removed a single document from the stack. It was a faded copy of an old bank register, the pages yellowed with age and the text blurred in places. On the first page was the heading, "List of active and closed accounts of Heritage First Bank for 1973. Next to the neatly printed numbers, 211, 212, 213. Suddenly a strange entry appeared, 214 C. E. Whitaker. Close. Not eligible for reinstatement. By order of the director. Rick involuntarily jerked forward, gazing into the lines. His gaze slid upward, standard accounts of old customers, then downward, again typical entries, nothing suspicious. But this account stuck out like a foreign body in a familiar system. Rick had reviewed many registers in his career, but never once had he seen anything like this. He frowned and nodded demurely, muttering that he'd check it out. At that moment, Dennis, leaning lazily against the door jamb, grinned and without hiding his disdain threw in, "Another fantasist. The old man is clearly determined to put on a show, maybe counting on us paying him something to get rid of him." His voice was louder than it needed to be in the confined space. Charles looked up at him with a look in which there was not a shadow of annoyance. His voice sounded soft, almost calm, but there was an inner strength in that calmness. "If I was looking for easy money, I would have come here about 30 years ago. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for justice." Rick felt a slight but unpleasant chill sweep over him. Something in the old man's tone made him inwardly tense. He reached for the phone on the desk, pressed the internal number for the archives and, waiting for a response, dryly told him to check the database for a customer with account number 214, Charles E. Whitaker, 70s. It didn't take long for the answer to come. The calm voice of the archivist on the other side of the wire said that there was no information about such an account in the database. Neither in the active, nor in the closed, nor in the archives on obsolete documents. Rick hung up the phone carefully, but his fingers trembled. He looked at Charles and said slowly, "That account doesn't exist. At least not in the database." Charles didn't change his face. He leaned forward slightly, bowing his head as if this was exactly what he expected. His gaze remained as calm as the water in a still pool. "That's what they always did. Wiped off the tracks. You do realize that a bank that builds its story on lies will never pursue the truth, don't you?" Rick leaned back in his chair, feeling the tension slowly filling him from the inside out. The phrase sounded far too confident for a mere fantasist. Outside the office, the familiar banking day continued, the quiet hum of voices, the clinking of coins, the rustling of paper bags. But here in this office, it was as if the air had grown thicker, and something heavy, real, and inexorable hung in it. Rick was about to end this strange conversation and politely but firmly ask Charles to leave the office when he suddenly bent calmly to his dilapidated suitcase and carefully unzipped it all the way. His movements were slow, as if he were about to pull out something priceless or dangerous. From the depths of the suitcase, Charles pulled out a thin leather folder, frayed at the edges, with metal corners, as if it had been picked up more than once over the years. Carefully spreading the folder out on the desk, he unfolded it, revealing a single sheet of paper neatly enclosed in a transparent file. Rick automatically reached for the document with his eyes and instantly grasped that it looked like a notarized power of attorney. At the top was the name of the bank in crisp old letters, Heritage First Bank of Memphis. Below that was the date, September 1972. And below that was the substance of the document, a power of attorney to transfer property assets from Charles E. Whitaker to Heritage First Bank with the power of trust. Rick frowned. He glimpsed the lines and suddenly noticed that there were two signatures at the bottom. One was the president of the bank at the time, Walter Greenwood, a man whose name he knew from the history of the institution. The second was the neatly embossed signature of Charles E. Whitaker. On the edge of the document was the seal of a Shelby County notary public, stamped with a serial number and signature. The paper was obviously old, yellowed, creased in places. Rick inwardly tensed. His professional eye told him that if it was a forgery, it had been done with a skill that not everyone could match. But the strange thing was different. This document looked real. Second after second passed as Rick stared at the papers, his thoughts flitting between doubt, irritation, and barely perceptible fear. Outwardly he remained calm, but a sense of unease was building in his chest. He realized how serious the consequences of this piece of paper could be if it were genuine. Through the glass partition of the office, Rick noticed several employees in the main room begin to glance toward the door behind which he was with Charles. People exchanged brief glances. Someone even made a gesture toward the office as if asking what was going on there. Dennis continued to stand by the door, arms crossed over his chest, but there was a strange tension in his posture now. He clearly expected Rick to stop this farce at any moment. Meanwhile, Charles leisurely raised his head and, as if continuing his usual conversation, calmly said, "It all started with my capital. This bank was built on my money. But as soon as the business started turning a profit, they invalidated the deal, voided the documents, and crossed out my name. It was like I never existed." Rick wanted to ask who exactly did that, but caught himself thinking he didn't want to hear it. The old man's words were dry, without a drop of complaint or anger, but each one sounded like the thud of a hammer hitting stone. For a moment a tense silence hung in the office. Rick opened his laptop, typed Whitaker's last name into the search engine, then narrowed the search to old court cases. Seconds later, a single match popped up on the screen: Whitaker versus Heritage First Bank. The case dated 1974, closed within a month of filing, bottom line, dismissed without cause. Rick read that line several times as if he hoped the letters would disappear or turn out to be a mistake. But they remained in place, mute witnesses to the fact that Charles's story might not have been fiction at all. His gaze slid back to the old suitcase, which seemed to hold not just a stack of old papers, but the key to something that touched the very foundation of the bank where he had worked for nearly 10 years. And at that moment Rick realized for the first time that this was no longer just a strange encounter with an elderly dreamer, but something far more serious than he was willing to admit. It wasn't more than half an hour after Rick had closed his laptop, trying to make sense of what he had just seen, when there was a tentative knock on the office door. The door opened ajar and Grace Henderson, one of the younger employees at the bank known for being quiet and inconspicuous, appeared on the doorstep. She usually kept out of loud conversations and even less out of conflicts, but now she was holding an old ledger with a worn leather spine. Grace entered slowly, not looking at Dennis, who twitched the corner of his lips in displeasure. She carefully placed the book on the table in front of Rick's without saying a word. Rick, holding back an inner shudder, opened the book at random, and almost immediately his gaze came upon a page covered with neat entries in strict accounting markup. Hundreds of lines, columns, and figures were all familiar to his eye, but one short phrase, written in ink pen in a slightly uneven but confident handwriting, broke from this slender order. Deal with Whitaker. Close. All on Matthews. Rick reread the entry several times as if hoping it would disappear or change meaning. But the words remained the same. And each letter was as if imprinted in his mind. The name Matthews came up for the first time in all this time in this strange story, and suddenly Rick realized why he was so disturbed by the whole situation. Matthews. The family that has controlled the bank's board of directors since its founding, the most powerful people in Memphis, weighing in on the board, politics, big deals, and even the courts. Those whose decisions were never discussed and certainly never questioned. Rick felt a cold lump clench in his chest. Charles's words and the strange documents from the suitcase were now adding up to a whole picture where there was no room for coincidence. If the Matthews were really involved in the closing of the account, the disappearance of the power of attorney and Whitaker's suspension, then it was not a mistake, not a forgotten case, but something far more dangerous, a deliberate, elaborate operation to squeeze one man out of the business and rewrite the bank's history. Outside, some strange tension began to thicken in the hall. The employees, noticing Grace leaving the office, began to whisper, casting brief glances at the closed door. The people in the room already sensed that something beyond the normal workday was happening. Dennis Brooks could not remain silent any longer. He moved sharply toward Rick, his face poured with anger. In a gruff voice with almost undisguised aggression, he demanded that the police be called immediately, before this old man starts a public circus here. His voice was almost a shout, and several employees flinched in surprise. But before Rick could say anything, Grace did something no one expected her to do. She calmly stepped between Rick and Dennis, putting a barrier between them, and quietly but firmly said, "Don't." Her voice was soft, but there was such determination in it that Dennis recoiled as if he had run into a wall. Charles watched in silence, sitting in the chair across from Rick. His face remained impenetrable as if carved from stone. Not a single muscle trembled. He seemed to have seen this dozens of times in his life and knew how such conversations usually ended, only this time he hadn't come to back down. Rick caught Charles's gaze and realized that he didn't need to say a word. Everything that was happening now was already part of something bigger. This was no longer a one-time attempt to solve a strange case, it was the beginning of something that would change the very nature of the bank he'd worked at for nearly a decade. At that moment, Rick realized that there was no turning back. All night Rick could not sleep a wink. The documents, the entries in the old ledger, and Charles's quiet words echoed in his head, keeping him awake. He realized clearly that if he kept silent now, he would become part of the lie as others had been before him. But if he spoke out, he would jeopardize not only his career but his life. Matthews did not forgive those who went against them. On the morning he arrived at the bank, he didn't lock himself in his office, didn't call a secret meeting. Instead, Rick stood in the center of the customer room, where the usual bustle was still simmering, and raising his voice slightly to block out the noise, calmly asked all employees and customers to gather. Slowly, holding his breath, he pulled the papers he had found out of the folder, the power of attorney, the register of accounts, the ledger entries. The sheets trembled slightly in his hands, but his voice sounded steady. Rick began to read aloud. First the official power of attorney from 1972, then the register page where the phrase "close. All to Matthews." Then excerpts from a court case that had been closed without explanation. The hum in the hall gradually subsided, as if the walls were absorbing his every word. Employees, cashiers, customers froze, forgetting their business. Their gazes slowly drifted to Rick's, as if no one believed they were hearing this seriously. When he finished, there was a deafening silence. No one said a word. Only the rustle of the paper he had placed on the counter cut the air. In that silence, everything sounded shock, shame, fear. People began to realize that the bank, the symbol of Memphis stability, had been hiding a dirty secret all these years, erasing from history the name of the man whose money their business had been built on. It was at that exact moment that Dennis lost control. His face turned purple, his eyes darting around the room, full of anger and panic. He moved sharply toward Rick's, simultaneously grabbing the gun he carried as a service weapon from his belt. Everyone around them gasped. A few customers instinctively backed away, but before Dennis could draw his weapon, Rick stepped forward without hesitation and stood directly between him and Charles. There was no defiance in his movement, only determination. He met the guard's gaze with his hand on the hilt and for the first time said what seemed to have been building up in him for years, "I can't be part of this lie anymore." The words came out quietly, but so clearly that they seemed to penetrate the very air of the hall. Everyone froze. Even Dennis froze in place, his hand trembling, but he didn't take a step forward. Suddenly, one of the employees, a young guy named Alan, one of those who usually kept to the shadows, came out from behind the counter and stood next to Rick. Grace came out next to him, her face still calm but her eyes glowing with hardness. Others followed them one by one. The men and women standing in the hall began to approach in silence, forming a living wall between Charles and Dennis. Dennis looked at them, his lips curled in a fierce grin, but he did nothing. The tension seemed to drain from him. He slowly released the grip and took a step back, his gaze no longer full of rage, but frustration and something like fear. Charles had not moved from his position all this time. Only now he put his palms slowly on the counter in front of him, his movements smooth, almost solemn. And calmly, without a shadow of challenge, he said, "I didn't come for money. I came to reclaim my name." Rick felt something shift inside him. It wasn't even relief or fear or anger. It was a feeling like he had done what he should have done years ago. He turned to the crowd and said clearly for everyone to hear, "I will take this case to court. Publicly." No one responded, but it was clear in the silence that something more than an argument over papers had begun here and now. A few minutes later, when Rick stepped outside after Charles, they were both silent. Charles stepped forward leisurely, his face calm. The morning sun illuminated his figure, casting a long shadow on the sidewalk. He didn't turn around. The doors of Heritage First Bank closed behind them with a soft click. Inside, more than just a group of employees remained. A revolution of truth had begun there. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.